1861, a parliamentary committee in Queensland sat down to investigate a report that 3 Aboriginal men had been chased down by native police troopers, shot through the head, and then set on fire to destroy the evidence. The officer responsible, a man named Frederick Wheeler, was called to give evidence. The committee chair asked him directly about his orders. Wheeler said he'd instructed his troopers to surround the camp and disperse the people in it. The chair pressed him. What did dispersing them mean exactly? Wheeler's answer was as plain as it gets: firing at them. The committee heard that Wheeler had overseen a larger massacre at a place called Dugandan, southwest of Brisbane, and that the 3 men burned at Fassifern were survivors of it. They heard Wheeler testify that the troopers had shot through the camp, killing women as well as men. Someone asked whether he thought that was a very loose way of proceeding, surrounding a camp and shooting innocent women. Wheeler said there was no other way. Wheeler kept his job. He served another 15 years before eventually being charged with murder in 1876, after a prolonged and brutal beating at the Beliando barracks led to the death of an Aboriginal man. Wheeler didn't wait to face trial. He fled the colony entirely and died in Java in 1882, having never been prosecuted for a single killing in his entire career. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Whadjuk Noongar country, and we acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about the Queensland Native Police, a paramilitary force created, funded, and commanded by the colonial government of Queensland specifically to kill Aboriginal people, that operated for more than 50 years across the colony and was described by historian Henry Reynolds as the most violent organisation in Australian history. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses the systematic, state-sanctioned killing of Aboriginal men, women, and children over more than 5 decades. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 1392-76. Alright, let's go back to how a colonial government ends up establishing a paramilitary force whose sole documented purpose was to kill its own subjects. By the late 1840s, squatters were pushing into the districts north of the Darling Downs and beyond, into country belonging to dozens of Aboriginal nations who'd never consented to British occupation and who were making that very clear through sustained organised resistance. Cattle were speared, huts were burned, shepherds were attacked, and the colonial government of New South Wales, which still controlled what would eventually become Queensland, needed a way to push that frontier forward without declaring a war it would have to formally justify to London. The solution was the Native Police. Established in its northern form from 1848, the force was composed of Aboriginal troopers recruited from areas far distant from the communities they were deployed against, specifically so they had no kinship ties that might inhibit what they were being asked to do. Each unit consisted of around 6 to 8 Aboriginal men under the command of a single white officer. Their operational area moved with the frontier itself, pushing steadily north and west as squatters claimed new runs, with the forces' camps establishing themselves specifically in strategic positions along the expanding edge of European settlement. Researchers have identified nearly 200 such camps across Queensland. The word they used for what the Native Police did was dispersal. It appeared in newspapers, in government correspondence, in parliamentary reports. It appeared, as we already heard from Wheeler, in sworn parliamentary testimony, and everyone involved understood exactly what it meant. Many of those dispersed were killed while fleeing Native Police troopers. The coded language served a specific purpose. Using the word disperse rather than kill meant official documents never directly recorded that anyone had been murdered, making later accountability almost mathematically impossible. It also meant that the private instructions officers were given in the field, the actual tactical guidance about how to conduct these operations, were almost never written down at all, since putting that in writing would have produced exactly the kind of paper trail nobody wanted. Using Aboriginal troopers also prevented reports emerging in the press about massacres. Aboriginal people were not considered reliable witnesses to murder, and were not sufficiently literate in English to leave written testimony. The force, by its very design, produced its own silence. How did they actually recruit those Aboriginal troopers? In the early years, through what was presented as voluntary enlistment, though the conditions most recruits came from, poverty, dispossession, the collapse of traditional food sources, left very little voluntary about it. By 1873, the Queensland government was formally approving remissions of prison sentences for Aboriginal prisoners who agreed to become Native Police troopers, a practice that continued through the 1880s. Men serving long sentences for violent offences could earn their way out by joining the force. The government was, in other words, pulling Aboriginal prisoners from colonial jails and deploying them against other Aboriginal communities, a system that created Aboriginal instruments of colonial violence from the very population that violence was targeted at. Desertion was the greatest persistent problem the force faced, with many Aboriginal men quickly realizing what was expected of them and running away from the force's camps soon after joining. The rate of desertion in a force this violent and this deliberately designed is its own quiet record of resistance. The troopers themselves occupy a genuinely complicated place in this history. Many were essentially coerced into service. Some came from nations that had their own reasons for conflict with communities they were being deployed against. The force's recruitment strategy of using distant groups exploiting rather than creating those tensions. Some clearly formed genuine bonds with their white commanding officers, and some equally clearly tried to resist or limit the worst of what they were ordered to do. A traditional owner named Vince Harrigan, interviewed in recent years about his grandfather's accounts of a massacre at a waterhole near a Native Police camp, described hearing that they were hunted down like animals, and said he could still hear, through those passed down accounts, the sound of children crying. An Aboriginal woman in 1882 described the Native Police troopers using the same word she used for a rifle. The troopers and the guns, in her mind, meant the same thing. The officers commanding these detachments were, in the main, either retired military men, the sons of soldiers, or young men seeking adventure on a colonial frontier with very little interest in the paperwork that was supposed to govern what happened out there. Some were openly sadistic. Frederick Wheeler, whose parliamentary testimony we started with, had a career spanning 2 decades, during which he is documented to have been involved in multiple massacres across the colony. After the 1861 inquiry, the committee decided Wheeler had acted with indiscretion, but that, because he was considered a most valuable and zealous officer, the appropriate punishment was redeployment to another region. Not dismissal, redeployment. He simply moved to central Queensland and kept going. In 1851, an officer named John Murray wrote in correspondence that the local Aboriginal people had suffered severely and been taught a lesson, reflecting the explicit, unapologetic framing these officers brought to their work from the very beginning. The scale of what this force did across more than 50 years is genuinely difficult to quantify, because the very nature of its record keeping was designed to prevent precise accounting. What we can say is that historians who've spent years working through Queensland state archives, cross-referencing reports, correspondence, and survivor accounts, estimate the death toll runs into the thousands. Some estimates have placed the figure as high as 60,000 Aboriginal people killed by the Native Police and associated settler violence across Queensland's colonial period, though that broader number is contested and includes violence beyond the force itself. What's less contested is the historian Jonathan Richards's assessment, developed across years of archival research in his book The Secret War, that the force operated across hundreds of separate violent engagements over its operational lifespan, and that its activities led to what he carefully assessed as genocidal outcomes, with families and clans massacred specifically to remove Aboriginal people from country that was commercially valuable to white settlement. Queensland's own parliament, at various points, received and reviewed this information and essentially endorsed it. The 1861 committee that heard Wheeler's testimony concluded the force was working as intended. A further parliamentary inquiry in 1874 into reports of widespread massacres in the north of the colony heard testimony describing what one newspaper at the time called a war of extermination, and produced almost no practical consequence for the officers involved. Settlers, who wrote privately about what was happening, were often far more blunt than official sources. One settler's diary, from 1839, cited in Ian Clark's research into Western Victoria, and since quoted in broader histories of Queensland too, described taking up a new run in frontier country as being only possible for a man whose conscience was, in his own words, sufficiently seared to slaughter natives right and left without remorse. That sentiment didn't require frontier life to produce it. It was baked into the entire economic structure of Australian pastoralism at that period. The political economy of the colony depended on cheap land, cleared of its traditional occupants, as fast as possible. The Native Police was the instrument that made the clearing happen at the pace the colonial economy required, and the government that created it understood exactly what it was creating. The force began winding down from around the turn of the 20th century, partly as the frontier moved into the Northern Territory and beyond Queensland's colonial borders, and partly as public scrutiny from journalists, novelists, and a small but vocal humanitarian lobby made the more egregious operations politically embarrassing, even in a colony that had never been particularly interested in scrutinising them before. The last native police camps in Queensland were closed around 1915. For decades after that, the story of the native police largely disappeared from mainstream Australian history. It survived in Aboriginal communities, carried in oral tradition through exactly the kind of accounts Vince Harrigan shared about his grandfather's memories of the Waterhole Massacre, but it was rarely discussed in classrooms, even in Queensland. It took historian Jonathan Richards's comprehensive archival research, published as The Secret War in 2008, to give the subject the kind of rigorous, documented treatment it had always warranted, and the ongoing archaeological work of researchers like Linley Wallace, Bryce Barker, and Heather Burke, who've been physically excavating the sites of native police camps across outback Queensland, cataloguing bullets, cartridges, and uniform buttons in the dirt of locations where the records say nothing useful happened, to start building a material record to sit alongside the paper one. The camps themselves don't look like battlefields. There are no mass graves in the traditional sense, no large fortified buildings, no victims with bullet wounds left in the ground. Instead, the native police camps are ordinary, banal even, their physical remains limited to stone fireplaces, fence post holes, clearings, and rubbish dumps scattered with broken bottles. Researchers have found more than 100 bullets and cartridges at individual camps, in concentrations too dense to be explained by target practice alone. What the material record doesn't contain, because it was never meant to contain it, is any direct trace of the people who were killed nearby. That silence is itself a kind of evidence, a record of erasure so thorough that even the archaeology has to work around it. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A parliamentary committee that heard an officer describe shooting through a camp killing women alongside men, and concluded the force was working exactly as intended. A 50-year campaign of killings described in official correspondence with a single word, dispersal, specifically chosen, so nothing incriminating ever had to be written down. A force of Aboriginal men recruited from distant nations, some coerced by prison sentences, most never mentioned in any surviving record by name, deserting whenever they could, and being replaced by the next group dragged in from the jails. A death toll that can only be estimated in ranges of thousands, because precision was the one thing nobody in authority ever wanted, and camps scattered across remote Queensland whose rubbish dumps are full of bullets, but whose ground contains no trace of whoever those bullets were used on. This is the episode in this series that probably deserves the most uncomfortable question. Every other massacre or crime we've covered on this show happened. This was a system, not a moment of frontier violence that got out of hand. Not one rogue officer acting on his own. A structured, funded, officially commanded institution operating continuously for more than 50 years, with full parliamentary awareness, periodically scrutinised by that parliament, and found to be doing its job. If the question this show keeps circling around is why so much of this history has been kept out of classrooms and public memory for so long, the Queensland Native Police is probably the clearest answer. because naming it plainly means admitting not just that violence happened, but that a government built it, paid for it, and deliberately preserved a documentation system specifically designed to make it harder to prove. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.